Good morning. What a beautiful day in Kansas. We're thrilled and delighted to have so many people here for our 82nd Landon lecture. And we're privileged to have the distinguished Secretary of Agriculture, Clayton Yeutter. Before I introduce the 23rd Secretary of Agriculture in the history of America, let me just take a minute and introduce the people up here on the platform. To my left, Dr. Wayne Nafziger, President-elect of the Faculty Senate and a member of the Department of Economics at Kansas State. Next to him, Lorian Cuffey, major in business and president of the K-State student body. On my right, Edward Seaton, chairperson of the Landon Lecture Patrons and the publisher of the Manhattan Mercury and diplomat par excellence. And Chuck Reagan, my executive assistant and the chair of the Landon Lecture Series. Now, it is a beautiful day here. When I saw Clayton last night, he thought that I was unduly enthusiastic. And of course, he asked me, did it have anything to do with Saturday afternoon? And I said yes. For our 82nd annual Landon Lecture, we are delighted to have the Secretary of Agriculture for the United States of America. To begin with, Clayton was raised on a farm in central Kansas, and he still operates that 2,500-acre farm today and is a very, very excellent farmer. Coming from central Nebraska, you only have one choice, and that is to go to the University of Nebraska. Well, he went to the University of Nebraska, which is an excellent school, and with the highest distinction, graduated in 1952. He received his law degree from the University of Nebraska in 1963. Then he received his Ph.D. in agricultural economics in 1966 from the University of Nebraska and was a member of the Ag Econ department at Nebraska. Cliff Hardin, as you recall, former chancellor of the University of Nebraska, became Secretary of Agriculture under Richard Nixon. And the then Secretary Cliff Hardin wanted to have one of the outstanding and brilliant students from Nebraska join him in the USDA. Serving under both Presidents Nixon and Ford, Clayton was an assistant secretary in two different positions. Then, as you probably recall, he was the international trade representative, which is a very, very tough job, one of the most complicated and extraordinarily challenging jobs in the whole federal bureaucracy. And he was the U.S. trade representative under President Ronald Reagan from 1985 to the end of the second Reagan administration. In between those years, he was president and CEO of the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, another very formidable challenge. Now, our newest president, President Bush, has decided that Mr. Yeutter should be the 23rd Secretary of Agriculture. And what a thrill it is to have this superb spokesperson for agriculture and this excellent student of America, American history, and American agriculture, and just an all-around decent, warm human being. And I think he'll be a great Secretary of Agriculture. Would you please join me in welcoming our 23rd Secretary of Agriculture, Clayton Yeutter. Clayton?
Thank you. Thank you, John, and thanks to all of you for that very warm Kansas welcome. And special thanks to you, John, and to Ruth Ann for entertaining me so royally at your beautiful residence yesterday evening. I can have a lengthy nostalgia trip when I return to Manhattan, Kansas. I could take up the whole time this morning by reiterating my memories of Kansas State and Manhattan, but we don't have the time. But as many of you know, Dwayne Ocker, who was John's predecessor, was a longtime friend all the way back to my undergraduate days at Nebraska. Jim McCain, who was here when I headed the Nebraska mission in Colombia, South America, and came down there to visit us. And first time I ever came to Kansas State, I reiterated at dinner last night, was as a member of the Nebraska livestock judging team to come down and work out with Don Good and the livestock team here at Kansas State. I just saw a few minutes ago for the first time in years Wilfred Pine, who would have been my major professor had I done my Ph.D. here at K-State, and I almost chose to do so. It was marvelous to see Wilfred again, and I could go on and on. I've also so enjoyed working with your senatorial and congressional delegation, Nancy Kassebaum, of course, whose name is attached in directly, really, to the Landon series. Bob Dole, who's been such a magnificent leader in the Senate for so many years, and a lot of fine members of Congress as well. Mike Hayden, Governor Hayden, graciously helped in the transportation here, and I enjoyed being at the Education Summit at Charlottesville, Virginia with him last week. So with all of those connotations of Kansas State, it's a good feeling to come here. This morning I'd like to talk primarily to the students in this audience, but hopefully what I have to say might be of some interest or fascination to those who have left the student category in years past as well. First question one might pose is whether agriculture will be an attractive career for you students as you build your lives over the next several decades. My answer is an unequivocal absolutely. In my judgment, the potential for agriculturally related careers is truly outstanding today, notwithstanding the economic turmoil that we've gone through in American agriculture during this decade. One must always look ahead, not behind, and as I look ahead, the future is bright if we do the right things in the policy arena and in business and in a number of other areas. I'll embellish on that in just a minute. The potential for agriculture is illustrated, first of all, simply by the demographics. We now have about 250 million people here in the United States, but the population of the world is 5.2 billion. We have the 0.2. 5 billion of the people who are living and eating in this world reside outside the borders of the United States. By the turn of the century, that population will be 6.2 billion. That's only about a decade away. The world will add 1 billion people in that time. 4 times the population of the United States today. 4 times in the next decade. And that means at the turn of the century, we'll still be the 0.2. It'll be about 0.26 at that time, with the rest of the world being about 6 billion. So we must say, as we evaluate the potential for American agriculture, can we play in that international ballpark? And can we find a significant role for American agriculture in helping to feed those 6 billion folks who live outside the United States? My view is that we can do so, must do so, and will do so. But there's some caveats to all of that. Life is never quite as simple as just demographics, and it is always much more complex than just numbers. So let's put some attention to place some attention on the caveats for just a minute. What I'm going to visit with you about this morning would be, first of all, the international opportunities that provide us the chance to increase farm incomes in the United States in coming years. Secondly, I'd like to discuss environmental issues just a bit because they're also on the public policy agenda in a major way today. And thirdly, I'd like to discuss the potential for broadening job opportunities in our rural communities. So if we have the time to go through all of these rather quickly, let's see if we can do so in a sensible way. First of all, the farm income picture. The job opportunities in agriculture for the students here at Kansas State and elsewhere. Agricultural trade policy, which is at the heart of the export opportunities that we may have in the coming decades, is today at a crossroads. What happens or does not happen with the trade policies of the major nations of the world over the next 12 months may well do as much as any single thing to determine the incomes of American agriculture over the next half century. As many of you know, we are now engaged in a major trade negotiation in Geneva, Switzerland, called the Uruguay Round. 96 countries, including the United States, are participating in that exercise, with 15 negotiating groups being involved, only one of which is agriculture. That negotiation is scheduled to conclude in Brussels, Belgium, the first week of December in 1990. So that means the 96 nations have just a little over 1 year of negotiations remaining. Agriculture is probably the most challenging issue on that entire agenda, and we will certainly have to negotiate with great skill over the next 12 months if we're to open up the export opportunities around the world for American agriculture that we all seek. What we must do is unlock those markets around the world so that we have a chance to compete for them. My judgment is that we have a very efficient and competitive agricultural plant in the United States. We simply need to have the opportunity to sell the output of that plant throughout the world. There are two major impediments to reaching that objective and to providing the kind of careers that you all would like to have in the next 20 or 30 years. One of these lies in the area of export subsidies, and the other one in the area of what I call import constraints. And let's take the latter one first. You see, what has happened is that there are a lot of countries around the world who would like to keep our agricultural products out for a whole variety of reasons. And they have very skillfully and effectively developed some creative gimmicks through the years for doing so. One of those is simply the application of quotas. And what that means is that no matter how competitive we may be, once we reach the quota amount in a given country, our exports stop. We can't sell another pound or another bushel, no matter how efficient we may be. Another is variable levies. The European community uses this, for example, where if we become more competitive and are able to sell at a more attractive price, the community simply increases their duties accordingly, so it neutralizes any advantage that we may achieve because of our competitiveness. That too is an onerous barrier. The third one is import licensing systems. They can deny us the opportunity of selling simply by refusing to give us a license, or giving buyers in their country a license to import. That's an excellent mechanism for keeping our exports out. The third one is to have minimum import price requirements. In other words, they require our prices to be up here a little bit higher than their local prices, so that obviously nobody will want to buy our goods. They would prefer to buy the locally produced goods. Those are just 4 examples. There are many others. The way to rid the world of those kinds of impediments is to do so at the negotiating table, and we have a chance, the first really good chance ever over the next 12 months. The other onerous set of activities arises from export subsidies. And obviously what that does is pit our farmers in Kansas or wherever against the treasuries of other nations. And again, it matters little how efficient your wheat farmers or sorghum farmers may be out in the country here in Kansas, if they have to compete against billions of dollars of subsidies provided by the governments of other nations who simply undercut them in the world market. I can recall a time a few years ago in which the export subsidies being used by the European community were so high that Kansas farmers could have given their wheat away and would not have been able to move it into some of the world marketplace. In other words, at a price of 0, we still could not have been able to compete against wheat coming out of the European community. Well, those kinds of policies are simply ludicrous, and we must change them so that we can move toward what people typically call a level playing field in the conduct of agricultural trade. But if we can do that, if we can achieve those objectives at the negotiating table, we can open up excellent opportunities for American agriculture and for the people who are going to be working in it in the coming years. I will give just one example of a success story so that we don't feel that there is no opportunity for success in this regard. And that arises from our beef and citrus negotiations with Japan, which we finished just a year or so ago. The estimate of the U.S. Meat Export Federation today, which is our exporting arm, if you will, for the beef industry of the U.S., is that beef exports now are adding about $3 a hundred to the price of fed cattle in the United States. And that's $3 a hundred to the bottom line. And any time that we can complete negotiations, and most of that came out of the Japanese negotiation, not all of it, but most of it, any time we can complete negotiations that will add that kind of additional black ink to the net worth statements of cattle producers or any other kind of agricultural producers in the United States, it's obviously worth doing. If we can duplicate that, emulate it on a global basis in a lot of other products, in a lot of other countries, one can visualize the earnings potential for American agriculture that could result. However, one must add a second caveat, and that is, assuming we have a level playing field, we must be able to compete. We should not take our international competitiveness for granted. We must make sure that we take actions here at Kansas State and elsewhere to make sure that we sustain that competitiveness. And that gets to what must be done to ensure that we're the low-cost producer internationally. Because if we're on a level playing field, the low-cost producer is likely to win. The way to do that, of course, is through research, technology, the development of management skills for people out in our production enterprises in Kansas and elsewhere in the country. We can do that, but that's an edge that we must sustain. In my judgment, we have that edge today. I believe that we've got the best research programs in the world. We're the most technologically advanced in agriculture anywhere in the world, and I believe we have the best farm managers in the world. But that is not to say that we can rest on our laurels and assume that that will be the case 10 or 15 years from now. We must make the capital investment in people and in research programs and in other such activities to make sure that that takes place. In addition, it's important that we maintain market share and increase market share around the world. We simply have to recognize that that's an important dimension of being a major player in the global economy. Earlier in this decade, we significantly lost market share. Our agricultural exports plummeted. Over the last 3 years or so, we've now been trying to earn that market share back. And it's been a very costly proposition. We've used a lot of export subsidies of our own, our so-called EEP program, to generate the financial support to regenerate those exports to where they were a few years ago. We've done that now. Our agricultural exports are today about $40 billion for the present fiscal year. And that's a major improvement over $26 billion where we were just about 3 years ago. But we need to sustain that momentum. I wish they were $80 billion instead of $40 billion. They could have been $80 billion had we sustained our momentum and build export share over the last 30 years or so. We can't go back and change the past 30 years. It's too late to correct the mistakes of the past, but we can avoid those mistakes in the future, and we can do what is necessary to protect and enhance market share around the world. The Japanese have learned that lesson well over the last 40 years. We ought to learn from them what it takes to become a successful participant in international trade. And finally, and this is a challenge for the students who are moving into the next generation of economic activity in agriculture, we also need to search for ways to identify and create demand opportunities, new demand opportunities for American agriculture. It's not just what we do internationally, as important as that may be, but it's also what we do domestically. We ought to be able to find some opportunities to grow milkweed to produce textiles, or to grow corn and produce biodegradable plastics, or to use corn in ethanol or ETBE as alternative fuels for automobiles later in this decade, or to produce kanaf for the printing presses of this country, or to begin to produce canola here instead of in Canada, because canola has some nutritional advantages as an oil seed that soybeans and some of our other products do not have. There is a bright future out there, or could be a bright future out there, for products which are not even in our vocabulary today. There's nothing that says that Kansas must grow wheat and sorghum forever. Let's grow what will generate the highest incomes. And 20 years from now, or 50 years from now, that could conceivably be crops or products that today we don't even know about, that are not even on the drawing boards of our research institutions or our commercial firms. Let's identify what it is that the people of the world wish to consume in the way of food products over the next half century, and then let's figure out how to produce the ones that will generate the highest incomes for American agriculture. And finally, my other caveat is that if we are going to be enormously active on the international scene, as I believe we must be if we're to achieve the high earnings that we'd like to see in American agriculture, we must make exports a high priority for this nation, not only in agriculture, but in the industrial sector as well. Over and over again during my tenure as U.S. Trade Representative, the representatives of governments and of other nations have come to me and said, what can you do to get your American firms to market more aggressively around the world? They're simply not doing so. They could sell more if they just work harder at it. And in many cases, that's true. The follow-up comment is, you have such a big market, such an attractive market in the United States, that most of your firms consider that to be your primary outlet, and you become interested in international trade only when you generate surpluses at home, and then you look for a place to put those surpluses outside of your borders. We take a different outlook. We consider your market to be our primary market, and our own domestic market is secondary. Well, in many cases, they have no choice, because this is the most attractive market in the world. But we ought to recognize that there are some excellent opportunities elsewhere in the world if we are dependable suppliers and aggressive sellers, and many of you have the opportunity in your futures to contribute to that end. Well, let me quickly go on to the final two topics that I'd like to discuss with you very briefly this morning. First one relates to the environment. The environment has been in the headlines a great deal lately. It's come up with, in the context of food safety issues such as alar in apples, groundwater quality in many areas of the country, including here in Kansas, soil conservation challenges of various kinds, our swamp buster and sod buster provisions of the 1985 Farm Bill. It's come up in the context of input levels that are provided in agricultural production today, the so-called LISA program, low input sustainable agriculture, and in many other ways as well. Without doubt, there will be a lot of additional public debate on this subject in the coming months and years. Next year, in the context of the 1990 Farm Bill discussions, but in many other areas as well and through separate legislation. I'd just like to make a couple of points with respect to this issue this morning, although one could easily do a full-scale speech on this subject all alone. And that is that I hope that we have the good judgment in America to make sensible public policy decisions in this area. And by that I mean that it is imperative that we analyze these very sensitive, emotional issues objectively, methodically, scientifically, and rationally. Unfortunately, the debate in many of these areas today is not objective. and the approach is not methodical. And the basis for decision in some areas has not been scientific. And the answers that have been provided have often not been rational ones. We ought to change that. We live in a democratic society in which we try to make the right decisions when we deal with sensitive issues. We need to have a little less emotion and a little more good sense in this area, and a proper balancing of the interests so that we come out in the right place and where that environmental pendulum swings. It seems that in democratic societies, we have a tendency to swing the pendulum too far. We swing it to one extreme, and then we get into difficulties of one kind or another, and we swing it back. But we don't stop in the middle. We swing it all the way to the other extreme. Then we get into troubles again, and we begin to swing it back. In the environment and in a lot of other public policy debates, it would certainly be advantageous and wise if we could swing the pendulum with a little less extreme movement. And I hope that we can begin to do that in the future. You can have an influence on that, both because at an institution like Kansas State, you can provide the research underpinning for these kinds of rational decisions, and because as citizens, you can evaluate what you hear and what you see on television and decide whether it really has been approached in the way that I've suggested. Is it emotional? Is it fear-oriented? Is it hysterical? Or is it objective and methodical? There's been a little too much of the former in recent months, not enough of the latter. Finally, I want to make some observations about what most of us would call rural development, but that's a term that has different meanings to different people. Through generating increased earnings from American agriculture, but rural communities go beyond our production plant. They go into what can be done in the small towns, the villages, and the medium-sized cities of Kansas and the other parts of our nation. We should have an interest in their welfare as well. And as agriculturalists, a particular personal self-interest because we must be concerned about the job potential for future generations. Is it necessary for folks in those rural communities to go off to Chicago or New York or San Francisco to find well-paying jobs? Or can we have some well-paying jobs out there in Clay Center, Kansas, or Phillipsburg, or wherever we might pose the question? My judgment is that there ought to be ample opportunities to expand the job base in those rural areas, and we should concentrate on those. Kansas State can play a role in that. State government has a role. The federal government has a role. So does local government, and so does the private sector. The question becomes how we can better coordinate all of those efforts, focus them in such a way as to achieve additional job opportunities and in such a way as to broaden the job base in that area. It's not easy. There's been a lot of rhetoric on the subject of rural development through the years, but not much productivity, not much output in the way of results. But my feeling is that we're approaching the time now where we can create some jobs in those areas, and timing is everything in this business. And if I'm correct in my assumption, then we ought to devote more time and effort to this rural development question. And I say that because fundamentally we have a well-trained, well-educated population. We have a good workforce in the rural areas of this country. Today, there is no reason why high technology production operations cannot be located anywhere. They don't have to be in a big city. It seems to me that it is advantageous for a lot of our high technology operations, plants, to be located in the rural areas of this nation. We ought to make that argument to the folks who are running high-tech companies and see if we can convince them of the merits to put those operations in Kansas or Nebraska or Iowa. The same applies in services. We've become a much more service-oriented economy, and there are lots of different services that are available today, the financial service arena being example. Citicorp put one of their major operations, their credit card operations, out in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and it's been a huge success and a magnificent addition to to the Sioux Falls economy. That's just one example, but there are innumerable others. In some areas, of course, there's recreation and tourism potential. Some areas it's forestry. I've seen what South Carolina has done in forestry. In others, it's food processing. We ought to be adding value to our corn and wheat and sorghum in our rural areas rather than shipping the products off somewhere and letting the value be added either in the big cities of the U.S. or in foreign countries. What we need is to develop some local leadership in this area, because I'm convinced that job creation in rural areas will never happen without excellent, vigorous, enthusiastic local leadership. Our agricultural extension people can help in that. Our research people can help. We should have consultants available. There are a lot of things that can be done by the university system, our educational systems, and by all these units of government in enhancing rural development in this country. Enough on the subject matter. Let me turn for just a minute as I close to preparation by students. I'm going to personalize this now down to the students themselves, because we do need to prepare you for the occupations which you will serve in your lifetimes. President Weefald and the Kansas State faculty are obviously going to do their very best in that preparation process, but it goes deeper than that. We need to start at primary and secondary schools. Now, it's a little too late in your case to have an impact there, but before very long you're going to be parents, and it'll be your kids coming up through those primary and secondary schools. We do pretty darn well in those institutions in a place like Kansas, but when one looks at the picture for the nation as a whole, we've fallen behind. All one has to do is compare test scores of students coming out of high school in the United States with students coming out of high school in a lot of other countries, and we don't compare. We ought to change that. That means making adjustments in our primary and secondary school systems. We just had an education summit in Charlottesville, Virginia, to talk about this last week. President Bush called that summit of all the governors and all the cabinet members, as you know. I chaired one of the sessions on higher education. Governor Hayden of Kansas was there at that session. We saw some very creative ideas emerge from that process that ought to be adapted in our primary and secondary systems if we're going to provide the training that our young people need in agriculture or anything else in the coming years. I'll give you one example coming out of Rhode Island that I thought was the most fascinating of all. Rhode Island is going to begin now to assign mentors to its grade school students in the 3rd grade. These mentors will be volunteers, grandmothers or whomever, and they will stay with these students from the 3rd grade through the 12th grade, 9 years as mentors. And if the students complete those additional 9 years, their high school education, meeting the standards that are set up in this program, they will be given tuition-free college educations. That's a major, major achievement in my judgment. I hope it'll be emulated in other states around the country. Michigan has something similar already. I suspect we'll see similar opportunities elsewhere. We've had 2 examples in recent years of athletes that have gone through grade school, high school, and 4 years of college here in the Midwest. 4 years of athletic competition in 2 neighboring states, not in Kansas. And then it was discovered that neither of those athletes could read. It seems to me that we ought to have a better educational system in this country than one that puts students all the way through 16 years of education and they still cannot read. Enough on that. Let's talk about college for just a minute. You need to get sophisticated in your education these days, because we live in a sophisticated world. And I'll let you students define what sophistication means. It'll be different depending upon your fields and different depending upon your future endeavors. But surely sophistication will be the mark of the jobs in which you occupy in the future. And because the international sector is going to be so important to all of you, I strongly recommend studies here at Kansas State or studies after you leave Kansas State in the culture of other nations in which you have a particular interest and in languages. I've often said that every American ought to speak at least one other language, and I feel that very strongly. Most of us do not do so. I had the good fortune of learning Spanish from living in South America, but many of us simply don't think about learning other languages. We've been insisting that our children do so, and I hope you all will insist that your children do so. It does make a difference, and I'm going to give you a personal example from my own family to illustrate the point, and I hesitate to do this because parents shouldn't be bragging about their kids, and I'll try not to do so here. But I'll do it to illustrate a point, because we have a daughter who's just about to emerge in her first job, and I will tell you what she did in preparation, because to me it illustrates what many of us, many of you, will need to do in your future careers. She did her undergraduate degree at the University of Nebraska, but she studied at Sophia University in Japan one summer while she was at Nebraska. She then did a master's in business administration at Georgetown, and while there did an internship with one of the large Japanese trading companies in Japan during one summer. She polished her Japanese language skills at that time, came back and qualified in Japanese in a program in international relations at Johns Hopkins. She's now finished that double master's degree program and has demonstrated her competence in the language, and she's just gone through the interview process. And I will say with some pride that she was offered positions by almost every company with whom she interviewed, I think all but one, and finally narrowed it down to where she's accepted a position with an American company, and she and her new husband will be moving to Tokyo in just a few weeks to start their lives off with a living and working experience in Tokyo. And as to whether or not it pays income-wise, I will say to you that she will be going out at an income level that's just a little bit below what I earn as a cabinet officer. So I'm not sure what the meaning of that is. I've talked too long, and we want to allow some time for questions. So let me just conclude finally by saying that in my judgment, the future for agriculture and the future for college graduates generally is a very bright one today. It's as bright as you make it as you go out into life. And if you have the typical enthusiasm of somebody from Kansas, I think you'll make it very bright indeed. But it'll be a different future. You must prepare yourselves to live in a world that will never look like the one that has been occupied by your parents and grandparents. The world is changing more rapidly today than ever before in its existence, and you're going to have to adjust to that. It's not a time, students, for people to go out on jobs with an attitude that is one of timidity. It's not a time to be risk averse. It's not a time to be resistant to change. If you fit in those categories, you'll experience a very frustrating life indeed. If, on the other hand, you're prepared to be a courageous risk taker, you're prepared to have a bit of the pioneer spirit that we saw in this country 100 years ago, and if you're prepared to be broad and creative and global in your thinking, you should have a very productive and rewarding career indeed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. Now we will have an opportunity for some questions. And as you know, we'll have microphones on the right and on the left. And so if you do have some questions, step forward and make your questions as concise as you possibly can.
And please don't be bashful. You can have questions that extend beyond agriculture if you like. I don't object to questions on any subject that have some relationship to what's going on in the government in Washington, D.C. I hope folks in Manhattan aren't shy this morning. Let's see. We got one? There's one down below. Let's do one from here. I'll repeat it. Question is, what about the disaster program? Because dealing with that issue in the context of the drought on wheat and then the follow-up activity on sorghum has been a very difficult thing this year. We are as frustrated as you are in dealing with that very difficult issue because it's been troublesome. It's been a most unusual weather year. Last year was a lot simpler to deal with because there was drought everywhere. And even though it cost a great deal of money in last year's disaster relief program, it was much simpler to handle from an administrative standpoint. This year is much more complicated because it's too wet in some areas, too dry in others, just right in others. And it's been very, very challenging and frustrating to all of us. The other problem, the fundamental problem in dealing with disaster legislation, is that it's difficult to have a program that really fits every individual farm situation. We have to simplify somehow, or as I put it the other day, we'll still be writing software 5 years from now. We have to try to organize the program in such a way that it's got some simplicity in order to be able to handle it. And yet when you deal with methods to make it simpler, then we run into unfairness situations. And that's been articulated over and over. It's very difficult to balance those interests out. Can it still be changed? Sure, but we can't change forever. What we discovered is when we try to make an adjustment to accommodate a particular unfairness emerges, we create an unfairness in 3 more places by doing that. Then we have to come along and try to figure out a way to take care of those 3 cases, and then pretty soon there are 3 more. It's really been an administrative morass. And that's a good reason why we ought to try to fix the crop insurance program and make it more effective so that we don't get into these kinds of complications and challenges for which there's simply no good answers. There's plenty of sympathy for what you've gone through out in Kansas because you've taken the brunt of it here this year, perhaps more than any other state. And there's ample goodwill on the part of the people in Kansas and in Washington to try to work things out if we can. But there also has to come a time when we stop changing the regulations and start administering, or folks won't get disaster payments for a long time to come. I wish we had good, easy, simple answers. All I can suggest to you is to continue to articulate the areas in which you're having trouble, and we'll try to be responsive if we can. But it's really a difficult issue to handle. And by the way, I hope we don't have to go through this again, but some of our meteorologists believe that we may be in a pattern of weather volatility now. This could well be a cycle. They won't say whether it's going to be a cycle of being too dry or too wet because we've had some of both this year, but it may suggest that that crop insurance might be wise for a few years if we really do have this kind of a volatile weather cycle. May not be a very good answer for you because I can't give you an individual response in your situation, but continue to communicate with us through your congressional delegation, and we'll have our ASCS people be as responsive as they can be.
Yes, with the future, or with the corporate farms doing so well, what do you see as the future for the family farm?
Well, I don't really accept your preface. I don't think corporate farms are doing all that well, and I don't think corporate farms will do all that well in the future. Some are. We have, as you know, some cattle feeding and hog feeding operations and some corporate farm operations in Florida and California and elsewhere that have been success stories. But I've never been either enamored with the idea of corporate agriculture or convinced that that was an institutional framework that would serve American agriculture very well. Putting it all another way, I see family farms being the bulwark of American agriculture through my lifetime at least. I'm not sure I can see beyond my lifetime, probably through your lifetime as well. And what we're going to see is more efficient, better managed, smoother operating family farms, a little bit larger than they are today, probably not much larger, but really good operations. I think the family farms that we have today in this country basically can compete with anybody in the world.
Yeah, just a comment and question, if I may. You spoke of the emotionality and of the debate and research in sustainable agriculture, and I would just state that the National Academy of Sciences recently released quite a long-term study on sustainable agriculture that had some very positive results. And my question would be, what do you plan to do to promote that type of scientific research that you spoke of?
Well, I hope we can do some reallocation in our own budget priorities that will permit additional research in that area and in other areas as well. I'm convinced that we have to make that investment so that we do sustain our international competitiveness and augment it in the coming years. We sometimes concentrate too much on solving today's problems and forget about tomorrow. And we need research in that area because, as you know, farmers are not going to reduce their usage of chemicals unless they're convinced that they can do so and sustain their profit levels. If they feel that a reduction in the use of chemicals is going to cause a concomitant reduction in incomes, yields and incomes, they're not about to reduce it. And you can't say to them, well, we've got some test plots up in Ames, Iowa that indicate that you can reduce your chemical usage in half without any problem. They're going to say, well, test plot in Ames, Iowa is not a test plot in Manhattan, Kansas, and I'm not going to pay attention to a test plot in Manhattan, Kansas either unless you get some field trials that indicate that this is practical out on the farm. So that's going to take some research and field trial activity and time for people to learn whether they really can reduce their level of input usage. If they can, farmers will happily do that, as you know, because inputs cost money. And if they can save money by using fewer inputs, they're going to save the money. So it's not a question of having to persuade them to spend less money. They will be enamored with the prospect of spending less money, but only if they can sustain their incomes. The research effort needs to be made. I hope we can say some more on that in the coming months.
Yes.
One over here.
We finally have a wheat disaster program, only to be penalized for double crop production being deducted. Were the wheat acres planted in the Corn Belt last summer on failed corn and soybean deducted from their payment?
Yes, that's very much the same question that was asked down below here. The double cropping issue has been a very difficult one for everybody to handle, there are, if there were nice, simple, easy answers, they would have been articulated by now. We've had a whole host of suggestions as to how to do that, but none of them are much more advantageous than any other. So we'll continue to keep working at it within budgetary constraints. As most of you know, that we've got about $900 million available for that program. We're not going to, there isn't going to be any more because that's all that's allocated under the budget process. So what we have to do is figure out how we can best use that money, and particularly how we can best respond to this situation, which is more difficult in Kansas than anywhere else. A lot of people have spent a lot of time on this over the last few weeks, but there's not an obvious, simple answer. Sorry about that. I wish there were.
One more question. Yeah, right over.
I wonder what the Department of Agriculture is doing about global warming. And the second question is, what are you doing about the patriarchal overrepresentation in agriculture? I notice the panel there is all males. And I assume that looking at agricultural departments across the nation that they're heavily overrepresented by males. And I wonder if that doesn't color your outlook on agriculture.
Well, it's a legitimate question. Let me first point out to you that the person accompanying me today is Kelly Shipp, my press secretary. Kelly, stand up. As you can see, that Kelly is female rather than male. And let me also add that we have some of our other assistant secretary nominees coming to Senate confirmation later this week, two of whom are female. And if they are confirmed, we will have three female assistant secretaries of agriculture for the first time in history. So maybe we're not all that patriarchal, at least we hope not. We certainly are delighted to use talented females in government. One of those whom some of you Kansans will know is Joanne Smith, who was the first lady president of the National Cattlemen's Association. She's already one of our assistant secretaries, and we'll have two more to join her before the next few days are up, and we're pleased with all of those. My chief of staff also happens to be a female, Patricia Carney. Now, with respect to global warming, I'm glad that came up because I really didn't focus on that when I talked about the environmental questions. My best judgment as a layman, and I'm not the expert in this area, is that we still do not know whether global warming truly is a threat to this globe. But it certainly would be prudent that we try to avoid that happening if at all possible. In other words, it seems to me, and it seemed to President Bush, that this is an area in which one should not take chances, and some prudent preventive medicine would be in order. So if we can take some steps in this country, in this world, that are likely to preclude global warming from becoming an issue, and perhaps serve some other objectives at the same time, it would be most wise to do so. Perhaps the greatest contribution that any of us can make to that potential threat is to go plant some trees. So I encourage everybody here to plant trees. That applies in particular to urban areas where a lot of our emissions problems emerge, carbon dioxide. Trees are one of the finest absorbents on the face of this earth for carbon dioxide emissions. We have been working on this within the administration in recent weeks, and although we're not prepared to make any public announcements yet, you can expect to hear more on that subject from the administration in the relatively near future. We're even pondering getting my wife involved in a tree planting program as well, and so we may get a little matriarchal involvement in global warming too, from within the Yeutter family. And the other comment I would make in this regard gets to an issue that's close to the heart of many of you here in Kansas, certainly to Bob Dole, who's been involved in this for a long time, and that's the question of fuels, ethanol or ethanol-based fuels, because there are environmental benefits to using these kinds of fuels. As you probably know, in the clean air proposal that was submitted by President Bush to the Congress here a few weeks ago, there would be a requirement, if it becomes law, of 500,000 vehicles a year starting in 1995 being powered by what are called neat fuels, clean fuels, or alternative fuels, such as ethanol or ETBE, and 1 million vehicles a year by 1997. That will open up some magnificent opportunities for American agriculture if the ethanol or ethanol-based fuels can be cost competitive by that time. We don't know the answer to that question yet. Part of it may depend on research here and elsewhere, but I do believe it behooves the agricultural community to investigate that very carefully, and behooves us and USDA to do so, because if that were to occur, we could make a very fine contribution to the environment and also a very fine contribution to the earnings potential of American agriculture. I see that President Weefald wants the students to go back to class, so I better get out of here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for an excellent presentation. Thank you so much for coming. It was a great crowd. God bless you very much. Thank you.
Okay.
After you spoke at the Midwest Governors Conference yesterday, a representative of the Commission of European Communities said that you're not being realistic when you seek the elimination of protectionist trade policies. Mr. Baroli said that we should be concentrating instead on the opportunities that will be created by the common market that will be the result of DC 1992. I'd like to know how you can expect to eliminate protectionism if an organization like the EC opposes that goal. How might a common market have impact on our trade business?
Well, the way we have to try to eliminate it is through political pressure on the community, obviously. We've been applying a great deal of pressure to the consternation of the community. One can fully understand why they would prefer not to change their policies, because they're in a situation at the moment where they can have their cake and eat it too, to our great disadvantage. That has gone on much too long, and we need to demand at the negotiating table that changes be made. What has happened, just to provide a bit of background, the community has been able, through its own common agricultural policy structure, has been able to isolate itself from the changing conditions of the global marketplace. In other words, they've been able to achieve stability in price levels at the expense of transmitting all the volatility of the world marketplace to others. Now, that's an excellent position in which to find oneself if that can be sustained. In other words, let the others take the blows of changes in supply and demand and consumer tastes around the world, but we'll isolate ourselves. Our view is that the community ought to share those responsibilities with the rest of the world, and ought to play by the same rules that the rest of us play by. It's been much too long that for much too long, they've been able to establish and implement their own rules with little or no concern for the adverse impact that it may have on others. That adverse impact, by the way, not only applies to the United States, and it certainly has cost us billions in agricultural exports through the years, but it also applies to the developing countries. If one is producing sugar in the Dominican Republic or the Philippine Islands, how can one expect to compete with the sugar subsidies of the European community? So they've had their policies have had a devastating impact on the third world, as well as a severe adverse impact on the United States. And let me just give you one example. We could spend an hour on this, and I know you don't want to, but if one looks at what's happened in grain production over the last decade or so, the community has increased its production over that time frame by something like 50 million tons, if I remember the numbers correctly. Isn't that right, Kelly? By approximately 50 million tons. And we have decreased our production by about 50 million tons, meaning that they've simply taken that much of the world market away from us through the use of onerous trading practices. We've tolerated that for much too long. It's time not to tolerate it. Whether it's realistic or not, I think it's realistic to expect them to change. Yes?
Some of the impetus for enlarging the wheat base out here in the face of a 14% overall increase in wheat production?
Sure, that's certainly part of the reason. There are a number of reasons for giving wheat farmers an opportunity to expand their production in a small way. This is not a substantial increase. The expectation is that it might generate about an extra 2 million tons of wheat production nationally, which is a nominal amount in terms of total wheat production. But there were 2 or 3 reasons for that. One, the principal reason is that we wanted to because of the low stock levels, we wanted to begin to replenish the so-called food security reserve, which ordinarily has 6 million tons in it, and that's been drawn down now to about 1.5 million tons. So if we can generate a couple of million tons of additional wheat production, that'll bring the food security reserve up to about half its traditional level. And in addition, it gives us an opportunity to demonstrate to the world that we are a secure and dependable supplier. As I said a little earlier this morning, if we are to be a participant in the world wheat market or any of the other global agricultural markets, we have to be there when our customers have needs. And we cannot afford to have stock levels that will not permit us to meet the demand around the world. We want to increase our market share in wheat and a lot of other agricultural products. We cannot do that if we don't produce it. If we're going to, if we expect to sell it, we have to produce it first. Yes.
Mike Bates with AP. Following up on that, this morning with the ag students, you said there's been an inordinate amount of concern about possible surpluses and so forth. The wheat producer groups here seem to think you're going to maintain market share at the expense of domestic prices and farm income, and they're calling it another extension of cheap food policy. Why isn't that the case?
I don't agree with that, and that's certainly not our intention. We want to increase incomes for wheat producers as well as the other segments of American agriculture, and we'll do whatever we can to do so. The earnings that wheat producers receive come from a combination of price and volume, not just price. We could have wheat at $10 a bushel if we wanted to and produce very little wheat. But if we were producing little and selling none internationally, that would certainly not be a way to maximize farm incomes in this country. What we need to look for is a combination of volume and price that will generate attractive incomes, and that's what we're hoping for. And we must take a long-term look, a long-term view of this. We can't say, well, we're interested in the price only in 1989. I'm interested in incomes in 1989 and incomes in 1993 and incomes in 1999. It's incumbent upon the Secretary of Agriculture to take a longer-term view of agricultural policy, and it's incumbent upon our farm groups to begin to take a longer-term view as well. If we concentrate only on a particular year now and ignore the future, then we do so at the risk of harming our long-term prospects. In other words, this gets back to my point of sustaining and increasing market share. If we're going to do that, and we're gradually going to earn a larger share of the world marketplace, we must put in place the policies that will do that. We made a big mistake in the early 80s, when we trimmed back on production in order to try to raise price levels here in the U.S. We did raise price levels. We didn't do very much at all for incomes, and what we did was destroy our market share internationally. And it has taken a number of years now to respond to those incorrect policies, to alter them, and begin to regain market share once again. We have, as I said this morning, we've got to learn from folks like the Japanese about the importance of protecting market share.
Quick follow-up. What happens if we do have a banner year, we get more than the 2 million you're expecting, and we're just swimming in wheat?
Well, then we ought to, we'll obviously have to take whatever policy measures are necessary to move that product into the marketplace. We have the potential help of the assistance of the Export Enhancement Program, obviously, in neutralizing the export subsidy practices of the European community and others. And there are a number of additional policy tools available to us, including export credit programs, and we'll certainly use those tools aggressively. But if we don't produce it, if we don't have it available, we're never going to generate market share. And by the way, the changes that we announced according to our own estimates, will increase the income of wheat producers. They will not decrease it. There will be a slightly lower price level, but higher income levels for those wheat producers. Back there.
Food imports, Mr. Secretary, what are they at now? Why are they
Well, most of the food inspection of imports is under the jurisdiction of the Food and Drug Administration, and I can't speak for Frank Young as Commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration, but I'm sure that Dr. Young would tell you that he believes that his agency is doing a satisfactory job of inspecting imported food. Others disagree with that. You've probably seen some media reports on that in recent weeks. That's including the GAO report. It will be incumbent upon FDA to respond to those concerns, because clearly it's their obligation to make sure that imported food does meet the appropriate food safety standards. We feel that we're doing that job satisfactorily in meat and poultry inspection. That's our part of the picture. We have very active and intense inspection programs of imported meat and poultry products, and we're confident that they are doing the job in protecting the American public. Yes?
Along that same line, since we're talking about chemicals, would you comment on the consumer trend towards organic produce? We're seeing that in Dillon's here and then that in Kansas. Would you please comment on that?
Well, the consumer is king as far as I'm concerned, and if consumers wish to purchase organic foods, it's their privilege to do so. They'll undoubtedly cost more than the foods than traditional foods, but if some or all of our consumers are prepared to pay that additional price, I suspect we'll have more farmers producing organic foods. Our farm population is likely to respond to that demand if it generates. At the moment, though, that's a very minuscule portion of the demand for food in the United States, and is likely to be for a long time to come. It seems to me that if the reason for a shift into organic foods is concern over the wholesomeness or safety of our food supply, our traditional food supply, then that's a misplaced concern. In my judgment, our food supply is wholesome and safe, and will continue to be so. I suspect there is as much health risk in consuming organic foods as there is in consuming foods coming from traditional sources. Yes.
Mr. Secretary, I spent 5 years in Illinois where there's ethanol in every gas pump, and before returning to my home state of Kansas where they treat it like poison here. And I'm curious, the Illinois cars are running okay. Are the petroleum people in Kansas missing the boat?
I can't give you an explanation because I don't know why there isn't greater usage in Kansas. We have a lot of ethanol in my home state of Nebraska. It's been, and a lot of ethanol consumption in Iowa as well. So there are a good many states in which it is used. Some of that may relate to the state tax breaks that are provided for ethanol, and I don't know what the tax situation is here in Kansas. But it's certainly an excellent fuel, and if it's price competitive, one would assume that folks in Kansas would willingly use ethanol in their vehicles, because typically ethanol boosts octane ratings, which is helpful, and as I indicated this morning, there are some environmental benefits to an ethanol mix as well. My judgment is that we paid insufficient attention to the potential for ethanol and ethanol-based fuels. I was alluding to that in my presentation this morning. I'll embellish it a little bit now if you'd like me to do so, particularly with respect to ETBE. I don't know how many of you are familiar with ETBE. Probably not very many. But there's a substantial amount of research going on at the University of Nebraska on this product, which is a derivative of ethanol. In other words, you first make ethanol and then you go from ethanol in the chemical process to a product called ETBE. My view is that if it can be demonstrated to be commercially viable, ETBE could well become the alternative fuel of choice for the late 1990s and the beginning of the next century. In other words, if the Congress passes a clean air bill of the kind that the President articulated, where we'll have to use what are called alternative fuels. Sometimes they're called alternative fuels, sometimes they're called neat fuels, and sometimes they're called clean fuels. But basically that means you got to burn methanol, MTBE, ethanol, ETBE, or natural gas in your automobile. And the question is, which among that group will emerge as the winner, either alone or more likely in some combination with gasoline?
The fact is that ETBE has an advantage over ethanol in that it can be transmitted through pipelines. One of the reasons that the gas companies or petroleum companies are not terribly enamored with ethanol is you can't mix it with gasoline in the pipelines. It has to be transported by truck, and that's an additional cost. ETBE, the derivative of ethanol, can be moved through pipelines, which is tremendously advantageous and also saves a lot of money. And also from an environmental standpoint, ETBE has advantages over all of these fuels. The most sensitive or protective of the environment of all of these alternative fuels is ETBE, and that's why we have some hope that there might be some economic viability emerge in that area, which would be tremendously beneficial to agriculture. Over here.
Eric Atkinson from KKSU Radio. The Conservation Reserve Program has been immensely popular with farmers here at the state. We understand that tentatively another CRP sign-up will be allowed, the 10th sign-up. After that, with budgetary considerations, what we hear is that beyond that, things are up in the air. Can you shed some light on the future?
Sure. As you know, we have about 32 million acres in the CRP at the moment nationally. And in the most recent sign-up, there were something over 4 million acres bid. We've not yet decided whether we will or will not accept some or all of those 4+ million acres. If we accepted all of those bids, and I believe our decision-making time frame is December on those, that would take us to about 36 million acres. The objective established by law is 40 million acres. In other words, we're, as a department, we are now undertaking a program that's designed to pull 40 million acres out of production in the CRP. And that would call for continuing to take bids until we reach the 40 million total. However, the reason there may be some uncertainty is simply because the Farm Bill debate will begin shortly after the first of the year, and the whole question of implementation of the Conservation Reserve will arise in that debate. In other words, people will early next year begin to focus on whether we ought to attempt to meet the 40 million acre goal, whether it ought to be reduced or increased, and there'll be arguments going both directions. I can tell you what the trade-offs are. One of the difficulties of reaching 40 million is that bringing land out of production, additional land out of production, now becomes increasingly costly. We have a budgetary crunch in Washington, D.C. on everything, as you know, with a $120 billion federal budget deficit at the moment, so it becomes a cost factor. And the cost per acre now to pull out more productive acres is obviously higher than it has been for these in the earlier bid processes. So that's one factor. The second factor is that some folks are getting worried about the impact on rural communities of pulling this much land out of production. Clearly, if that land goes into grass or trees, that affects the number of jobs in the rural community that are related to those acreages. And so the question is, are we doing damage to some of our rural communities, the hardware stores and the clothing stores and others who depend upon economic activity out in farm country? And the third part of it, which could tilt it the other way, is the point I made this morning about global warming and protection of the environment, which suggests that we ought to plant more trees. There is strong support for increasing tree planting on conservation reserve acres, either converting some of the existing acres that are now in grass into trees, or taking additional acres out of production and putting them into trees, or some combination of the two. So that opts to increasing the number, but all of those trade-offs will have to be evaluated, and the answers will come next year. Can we do one more? One quickie? Right here. It's under, the issue is under active discussion in Washington, D.C. Obviously, any announcements on that issue will come from the White House because that's a very delicate and sensitive question. My judgment is that a decision one way or the other will be made relatively soon, but it's a very fluid situation because of the political volatility that exists today in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. So it's it's an issue that has to be continually reappraised almost on a day-to-day basis because of the changing geopolitical circumstances that exist in that part of the world. Wish we, yeah, follow up? That is news to me. I suspect. Yes, well, I suggest that you search the source for any story that's there. I do not know whether that was a misquote or perhaps some premature exuberance, but certainly we are not in a position to make any announcements on that subject. well, I think there's no more that either can or should be said at this point. Okay.